In 2285, the USS Excelsior would be ready for trial runs of a brand new propulsion system known as the Transwarp Drive. And with a little sabotage by Captain Montgomery Scott, then Chief Engineer of the Excelsior, the Transwarp Drive would fail when the starship attempted to hunt down Captain James T. Kirk and his crew who had stolen the USS Enterprise. And as the franchise progressed, many in fandom would attribute Starfleet's future lack of transwarp velocities as the failure of the project because of Scotty's misdeed. But the question is, does that actually make sense? Well, today we'll find out. Hello and welcome to another episode of Does That Make Sense? A Star Trek themed web series that discusses various odd or inconsistent Trek topics brought up over the years by you, this channel's audience. In today's episode, we're taking a look at Scotty and the great experiment, Transwarp Drive. And as always, I'll be playing devil's little advocate about this topic, in order to foster amazing discussions in the comments section below. So without further ado, let's dive in and ask the simple question, does that make sense? It was a great idea, creating a new form of propulsion for a brand new starship class to make the audience watching Star Trek III: The Search for Spock truly feel how old the Enterprise and her crew really were. Later in the franchise, transwarp would be further defined, and we would even get some comparison numbers as to what the true difference was, and basically the beginning of transwarp speed would be equal to about warp 84 on the old TOS warp scale. When Star Trek The Next Generation came out, the idea of warp factor 10 being infinite velocity would be introduced, with transwarp velocities sitting just below that impossible speed. Because the Enterprise D was still traveling at mere warp velocities, and other species like the Borg having the ability to travel at transwarp, meant that obviously the great experiment had failed. Anytime I bring up in any of my videos the word transwarp, I'll invariably get a few commenters saying something along the lines of, "Oh well, if Scotty hadn't have sabotaged the Excelsior, then Starfleet's starships would be traveling at transwarp speeds right now." And if you don't give it much thought, simply looking at the surface of Star Trek III, then it's understandable why some people would come to that conclusion. But it's completely wrong. There are three reasons why this can't be the case, and why the Transwarp project had to have failed on its own accord rather than what Scotty had done to the Excelsior. The first being that Starfleet Command isn't dumb. After the Excelsior stalled when trying to engage her Transwarp Drive, you can bet Starfleet's best engineers were all over that technology, attempting to discover what had went wrong. And you can also bet that they would quickly discover someone had removed necessary components from the drive. The second and bigger reason we know the Transwarp project didn't fail because of what Scotty had done was due to the events of Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home. In that movie, our intrepid crew is charged with sabotaging the Excelsior, meaning Starfleet knew exactly what Scotty had done, or they wouldn't have been able to charge the team with that crime. And since they did know this, are we really to believe that instead of simply replacing the components, they instead said, "Oh well, I guess transwarp is a failure, scrap the project"? Of course, that doesn't make any sense. The final reason is the character of Scotty himself. Scotty is an honorable man, and once they saved Spock, I firmly believe that if Starfleet hadn't discovered the sabotage to the Excelsior, that he would have come clean. Scotty isn't actually a person to stand in the way of technological progress, especially with something like Transwarp Drive, that could be a complete game changer for the United Federation of Planets. I mean, instead of taking days or weeks for a starship to respond to an emergency somewhere out there in deep space, they could respond to said emergency in a matter of minutes or hours. So I think it does a disservice to Scotty's character to suggest that he would just keep his lips shut on what he had done to save his own backside. Like many of you, Although also not canon, I subscribe to the idea that the Transwarp project was indeed a failure, but that Starfleet had learned so much about warp travel and velocity that it would eventually lead to the rewriting of the warp scale that would become the basis for warp travel in the TNG era of Star Trek. But what do you think? Do you think the Transwarp project's implied failing makes more sense than Starfleet being that incompetent, or simply ignoring what had been done by Scotty to declare it a failure? Do you think that the knowledge gained from the failure of Starfleet's first attempt at Transwarp Drive eventually led to the rewritten warp scale we see in the TNG era of Star Trek? Do you have another option that you'd like to put forward for the galaxy to see? Well, leave your thoughts and ideas in the comment section below. I'm looking forward to reading what you have to say. Live long and prosper.